Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix and this is Dragon's Wake. $3.99 came out in the Steam store in December, and anything with a dragon in it I will have an immediate interest in. I like dragons. For example, I have a dragon that eats a taco and wears a sombrero named El Charro. You don't believe me? Here's the picture of it. Made by a friend of mine, a great artist. You could go check out her page in the description below if you want to. But will Dragon's Wake in particular be able to capture the mystique that is dragons? Before I begin, want to make sure you guys know this key was obtained from keymailer via the developer for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion in the end, but you guys should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Now, when you first look at the Steam store page, you may expect a childlike platformer, and in some senses you'd be right. The thing is that there's a consistent theme among the game in terms of its problems, and that's a tone problem. See, the game starts off with images like this, for example, for a cutscene, or images like this. It feels like childlike, you know, a sense of discovery and wonder. And then you get this sort of tone change that happens, a little bit darker, which is okay, except then you go to something like this. Now look, I've got no problems with exploring dark themes and exploring some of the dark side of human nature, for example, but this game in particular didn't handle that very well. You sit there behind a closed door and watch a person that you sort of saw from his birth get, slaughtered in front of you. It does not bode well for a cute platforming game. Very similar to Airscape, it just does not set the tone very well, and unfortunately if you're expecting a nice little adventure, you're not going to get it here because this game is actually dark. I like it, sort of, kind of, but I feel like the game just doesn't know what it wants to be at this point, and it kept on going back and forth. And that tone problem sort of carries over into gameplay. Now, the basics of gameplay are as follows. You need to get to the end of the stage or the end of the level to go on to the next area, and you do that by jumping around and using your fire breath and attacking things and eating them for health. Now, why I say there's a tone problem is that there's a difficulty tone problem. The game will go from rather easy at some points where you're just, you can sort of tank damage at times, to going to really, really hard at some points where bosses will be able to sort of annihilate you at times. And it's not necessarily a complicated enough system to be able to use a skill-based set in order to really deal with the problems. There's not a lot of tactics in the game, and I didn't expect that, but it does throw a lot of challenges at you at times. Some of the platforming is a little bit too precise for the nature of the controls here. The controls in particular feel a bit loose. It feels like those old games where you'd had to really work to get to a platform and get to the end of the platform, but what the problem here is the inconsistency, at least in my mind. It feels like the jumping mechanic is somewhat based on momentum. The idea is that if you change direction in midair, you're going to lose a lot of your sort of speed, but it felt very, very inconsistent. Making the same jump over and over again, I really couldn't get a real feel of how the game played out for its physics engine. I couldn't really replicate the same thing twice, which is a problem when you have to have some of the precision that you need in this game. On the flip side of that, the fire breathing controls are rather good. The idea here is that if you can jump into the air and breathe fire down on your enemy, it does feel like you have a good, precise control of it that you need to be able to, knock enemies out of the air, and it really feels like a dragon breathing fire, despite the fact that that's not real, sadly. The gameplay, however, is very repetitive. The basic idea here is that you have to unlock a switch or get to the next area and be able to, unlock a drawbridge, for example. But the thing is that you'll face a couple of different enemy varieties, but the basic idea here is that you either breathe fire on them or you bite them. And honestly, it doesn't really make a difference which one you do other than taking a little bit of damage. Yes, there are some upgrades in terms of being able to eat certain enemies for permanent upgrades to your jump and health, but in terms of enemy variety, it's not really there. Part of the major problem I also have with the enemies is that sometimes they're very hard to see in terms of their projectiles. In particular, some archers, their arrows just sort of blend into the background and you really have no idea where the arrow is until it hits you. They have some pinpoint accuracy at times which doesn't feel fair with some of the level design in question. And I think I have to take particular issue with the level design here. For example, I would be in a crowded corridor where there's not a lot of room to maneuver at that point. And you get these enemies where you have to bite them and they release ghosts that will fly at you. The thing is that in these tight corridors, there's not really anywhere I can dodge to very well. And in order for me to really dodge them, I gotta have precise timing. Even going slow and steady at times doesn't solve this problem. Unfortunately, the way that some of these enemies, they stay in a specific spot, and so you can't like lure them into a spot where, you know, you could deal with them easier. And unfortunately, that's a consistent problem along the enemy designs and things like that in the level, where an enemy is placed just so that I have to jump to a platform, and unfortunately the only way to deal with it is to jump once, take him out with my fire breath, and then have to go back and jump again to be able to get up to that platform. It just feels very, very unsmooth, rough in terms of the gameplay. I didn't have a good gameplay experience, especially in a long session. Now, probably the strongest element of the game is its art style, and while it isn't necessarily the strongest art I've ever seen, it does fit the themes of some of the elements of the game. In particular, some of the tone problems that the game has, at least the cutscenes do sort of capture it at times. Now, I will say that there are certain models that don't really work for me. It was hard to see, like, this goblin, for example. That is a goblin. It's not an imp or anything like that. And some of the enemies are really hard to picture in terms of what they actually are without some of the cutscene portions of it. But the cutscene portions in particular work rather nicely, in my opinion. It does have, again, a childlike quality to it. It's not something I would expect of, like, a Pixar, for example, but it works. Now, sound design is interesting, to say the least. The sound design annoyed me. In particular, with the idea of, like, biting something and, like, you know, eating something. It has this sort of sound effect that really grades on the ears. It was almost annoying, to say the least. You'll have this ally who's supposed to be this warrior. He ends up fighting this knight that, you know, has been chasing you for all this long time. And yet he has this very, very high-pitched voice in a minion-style-like voice that feels very, very off for it. You know, they all sound the same in essence, and I feel like that in particular, again, a tone problem with the game. It was hard to tell who from who in this case, except for, you know, the clothing aspect of it. Not a good level of characterization, etc., etc. The game also doesn't do a very good job at teaching you things. There's a particular ability that you'll need to actually crash down with your dragon that they show you a tutorial in, but in terms of knowing when to use that was a big problem. You were supposed to use it in a particular boss fight that you wouldn't have guessed unless if you looked at the rocks and sort of made the connection, but you never really needed that ability up to that point in order to do it, at least in my opinion. It would have been good to have a hint there after a while, or maybe like a example right before to sort of remind you of that ability. It was one of those abilities that unfortunately it had its very, very situational uses, and only when I just sort of tried everything against the screen did it actually click that, okay, this is what it wants me to do, I think. And this sort of leads me to my final point. The game in essence has an audience problem, in my opinion. It's too heavy for little kids in terms of some of the difficulty spikes, as well as some of the, you know, visuals that it may not be the most striking things I've seen, but considering the story and the way it starts, it would sort of give me problems of showing it to my kid for the way that, you know, it plays out. On the flip side, for people who are looking for a little bit more whimsy and a little bit more challenge, the game does have a problem with variety and gameplay, and honestly, it just has that sort of annoying essence to it, unfortunately, that's really hard to describe, but it just sort of wears on you at times. It doesn't give you the controls and the preciseness that you need, but it's always feeling just out of reach. Like, it would have taken a little bit more to get to that precise. Now, the game is only $4, and I have to sort of set my expectations appropriately, but the thing is that there are some good $5, $4 games out there, and I feel like, in particular with Dragon's Wake, the tone problem is where the issue is here. The thing is again, the audience problem, the issues with controls, and everything along that line, I can't recommend it. Now, if you liked what you've seen so far and you think you can get over some of these problems, Dragon's Wake may work for you. If you want a dark story, a sort of interesting tale that doesn't play out in words but plays out in sort of what the gameplay shows you, then yeah, it can work in that essence, but honestly, it wasn't for me, especially with even the theme of dragons, and I can't recommend it. Alright, this is Dragnix signing out. I hope you got an idea of what Dragon's Wake has to offer. I will leave my Steam review in the description below. As always, I would appreciate if you liked this video, if you did like the review and the content within it, and dislike it if you didn't, so I know exactly what I need to change. Comments are always appreciated so that I can improve, and if you want more content like this, hit that subscribe button because that always helps the channel. Alright, I will see you all later. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button in the middle of the screen. The last video I did will be in the top left, and a related video to this will be in the top right. I do have a Twitter handle at the bottom left, and a Facebook page at the bottom right. And of course, you can always subscribe to the Google Plus portion. Anyway, thanks for watching, and keep on gaming.